The needle snapped in his hand as the soldier's body convulsed on the operating table, blood spraying across Dr. Emil Krasner's surgical mask in a fine mist that tasted of copper and death. The man's veins had turned black beneath the skin, threading up his arms like ink through water, and his screams had stopped 3 minutes ago, not because the pain had ended, but because his throat had swollen shut. Outside the field hospital tent, another artillery shell shrieked overhead, and Krasner felt the ground shake as it hit somewhere in the valley below. The soldier's pulse was fading under his fingers. 12 men had died this way in the last 48 hours, their blood turning to something thick and poisonous, their organs shutting down one by one, while Krasner stood helpless with his useless instruments and his inadequate training. The infection was moving faster than anything he'd seen in medical school, faster than anything in the textbooks from Vienna or Berlin. And now, as he watched the 13th man begin to die, Krasner made a decision that would either save thousands or destroy what remained of his career, and possibly his sanity. Wait, before the next revelation happens. If this story has already pulled you into the battlefield, tell us where you're watching from. To make sure you don't miss any forgotten acts of courage or impossible inventions, subscribe and join our front line of history. The mission's just getting started. Now, back to the scene. The field hospital sat in a converted monastery 3 kilometers behind the front lines of the Eastern Front, autumn 1943. The stone walls that once echoed with Gregorian chants now rang with the moans of dying men and the metallic clatter of surgical instruments. Dr. Emil Krasner had been there for 6 months, having been transferred from a teaching position at the University of Prague after he'd published a paper questioning the military medical establishment's approach to battlefield infections. They'd called him a radical then. Now, as he stood over the dying soldier, his white coat stained with the blood of men he couldn't save, he knew they'd call him something far worse for what he was about to do. The infection had appeared 2 weeks ago. At first, they'd thought it was simply sepsis from contaminated wounds, common enough in field conditions where sterilization was a luxury and speed was survival. But this was different. The wounded men would come in, stabilized after surgery, seemingly on the path to recovery, and then, within hours, their conditions would deteriorate catastrophically. Their blood would thicken, their temperatures would spike to levels that should have been impossible, and dark discoloration would spread from their wounds like shadows creeping across their skin. The standard sulfonamide treatments did nothing. Penicillin, the miracle drug everyone whispered about but few had access to, was nowhere to be found on this forgotten stretch of the Eastern Front. Krasner had sent reports up the chain of command. He'd requested specialists, additional supplies, anything that might help him understand what he was fighting. The responses had been curt and unhelpful. Make do with available resources. Priority supplies reserved for primary operations. Translation: soldiers at the front were more valuable than soldiers dying in hospital beds. The calculus of war was brutal and simple. But Krasner had always been unable to accept simple answers. He'd grown up in a small village outside Prague, the son of a veterinarian who treated farm animals with a combination of folk wisdom and improvised chemistry. His father had once saved an entire herd of cattle from a mysterious illness by creating a serum from the blood of a recovered cow, filtering it through layers of cloth and charcoal, and injecting small doses into the sick animals. The local farmers had called it witchcraft. His father had called it basic immunology. Young Emil had watched the process with fascination, seeing in his father's rough hands and makeshift equipment the seeds of something profound. The idea that solutions didn't always come from universities and laboratories, that sometimes the answer was in the blood itself. Now, as the 13th soldier's pulse fluttered and failed beneath his fingers, Krasner felt that old memory surface with the force of revelation. "Nurse Adamek," he called out, his voice cutting through the ambient noise of suffering. "I need you to prepare a transfusion kit and bring me the blood samples from the recovered patients." Nurse Martha Adamek appeared at his elbow, a woman in her late 30s with gray eyes that had seen too much and hands that never shook. She'd been with the hospital since it opened, had worked through every nightmare the war had thrown at them, and Krasner trusted her judgment more than he trusted his own at times. "Dr. Krasner, the patient is already gone," she said quietly, checking the soldier's carotid artery with professional efficiency. "There's nothing more we can do for him." "I'm not thinking about him," Krasner said. "Not anymore. I'm thinking about the next one, and the one after that." He stripped off his bloody gloves and turned to face her directly. "How many patients have we had who survived this infection?" Adamek's eyes narrowed. 3 out of 47 infected. "But doctor, they didn't survive because of anything we did. They just recovered. Their immune systems fought it off somehow." Exactly. Krasner was already moving toward the storage area where they kept medical records and samples. Their immune systems developed antibodies, natural antibodies against whatever pathogen is causing this. If we could extract those antibodies, create a serum from their blood— "That's not standard procedure," Adamek interrupted, but her voice carried more curiosity than concern. "We don't have the equipment for that kind of work." "We don't even know what we're fighting. This isn't a laboratory, doctor. We can barely keep the surgical tools sterilized." "My father saved 50 cows with less equipment than we have here," Krasner said. He found the files, pulled them out, began scanning through the medical histories of the 3 survivors: Private Novak, Corporal Benez, Lieutenant Dvorak. All 3 recovered within 5 days of infection. All 3 are still in the recovery ward. We draw their blood, we process it, we create a serum, and we test it. "Test it on whom?" Adamek asked, and there was the question that made this proposition either brilliant or insane. Krasner looked at her steadily. "On the next man who comes in with symptoms. Because right now, without intervention, that man has a 93% chance of dying. A serum might give him a fighting chance." "A serum you'll be creating in a field hospital without proper laboratory conditions, based on a technique used on livestock," Adamek said. "If it goes wrong, you'll be court-martialed. If it kills a patient, you'll be shot. And if I do nothing, more men will die." Krasner closed the file. "I've watched 13 men die in 2 weeks, Marta. I've watched them scream and convulse and bleed from their eyes while I stood there with my expensive Vienna education and did absolutely nothing that mattered. I won't watch a 14th. Outside, the artillery barrage intensified. The candles that provided light in the stone corridors flickered with each impact, casting dancing shadows across the walls. Somewhere in the distance, men were killing each other over a few hundred meters of frozen ground. Here, in this improvised sanctuary, Krasner was proposing to fight a different kind of war, one against an invisible enemy with weapons he'd have to forge himself. Adamek studied him for a long moment. Then she nodded once curtly. "I'll prepare the transfusion kits, but we do this properly, doctor." "We follow every sterilization protocol we have. We document everything. And if something goes wrong, the responsibility is shared. I won't watch you face a firing squad alone. If this works, there won't be a firing squad," Krasner said. "And if it doesn't?" He didn't answer that question. Instead, he moved toward the recovery ward, his mind already racing through the process. Draw blood from the survivors, separate the serum from the cells, filter it for contaminants, calculate the proper dosage based on body weight and infection severity, prepare the injection, find a patient willing to undergo an experimental treatment, and pray that his father's folk medicine scaled up from cows to human beings. The recovery ward occupied what had once been the monastery's chapel. The stained glass windows had been blown out during a bombardment 3 months ago and replaced with wooden boards, but the vaulted ceiling remained intact, giving the space an echo that reminded everyone that this had once been a place of faith. Now it was a place of healing, or at least attempted healing. Private Novak was awake, sitting up in his cot and trying to eat a thin soup. He was 22 years old, with the gaunt face of someone who'd lost too much weight too quickly. The dark veins that had spread across his arms during his infection had faded to faint tracery, like old scars. "Private Novak," Krasner said, pulling up a stool beside the cot. "How are you feeling today?" "Like I was dead and came back, sir," Novak replied. His voice was hoarse, damaged by the infection's assault on his throat. The nurse said, "I was lucky." "You were. Your immune system fought off an infection that killed most of the other men who contracted it." Krasner paused, choosing his words carefully. "I need your help to save the next group of men who come in with what you had." Novak set down his soup. "What do you need, doctor?" "Your blood, about half a liter." "Your body has developed antibodies against the infection. If we can extract those antibodies and give them to infected patients, we might be able to save their lives." The young soldier didn't hesitate. "Take what you need." It was the same with Corporal Bennis and Lieutenant Dworak. None of them asked about the risks, about whether the procedure was approved, about what would happen if it failed. They'd all seen men die from the infection. They'd all heard the screams. They understood that in war, you took the chances you were given and hoped they were enough. By midnight, Krasner and Adamek had drawn blood from all 3 survivors. They worked in a small storage room that Krasner had converted into a makeshift laboratory, using equipment scavenged from various parts of the hospital. The blood samples sat in glass bottles, already beginning to separate as the cells settled and the serum rose to the top. "We need to centrifuge it," Krasner muttered, staring at the bottles. "Separate the serum more efficiently." "We don't have a centrifuge," Adamek pointed out. "Then we improvise one." Krasner's mind was working in overdrive, drawing on half-remembered lectures and his father's creative problem-solving. The old well outside the monastery, it has a wooden bucket on a rope. If we secure the bottles inside the bucket and swing it in a circle, the centrifugal force should do the same work as a centrifuge. It won't be perfect, but it might be enough. Adamek stared at him. "You want to create a medical serum using a well bucket? Do you have a better idea?" She didn't. 15 minutes later, they were outside in the cold October night, swinging a wooden bucket in wide circles above the stone well, while somewhere in the distance, artillery continued its relentless percussion. Krasner had calculated the rotations per minute needed to approximate laboratory conditions, had secured the blood samples in padded wrapping to prevent breakage, and now he was spinning a bucket like a madman while Nurse Adamek kept watch to make sure no one saw them. It was absurd. It was desperate. It was exactly the kind of improvisation that the war demanded. After 20 minutes of continuous rotation, Krasner's arms were burning and the samples had separated cleanly. The red blood cells settling at the bottom, the clear yellowish serum floating at the top. They brought the bottles back inside, and Krasner began the painstaking process of extracting the serum with a syringe, drawing it off carefully to avoid contaminating it with blood cells. "Now we filter it," he said. "We need to remove any remaining cellular debris, any potential contaminants." They used layers of sterilized gauze and cotton, creating a makeshift filtration system that would have made his university professors weep. The serum dripped slowly through the layers, each drop representing hope or disaster, depending on how the next few hours unfolded. By 3 in the morning, they had approximately 400 milliliters of filtered serum. It was pale yellow, slightly viscous, and contained the antibodies of 3 men who'd survived the impossible. Krasner held the bottle up to the candlelight, examining it with a mixture of pride and terror. "This is either medicine or poison," he said quietly, "and we won't know which until we use it." "Then let's make sure we use it right," Adamek replied. She was exhausted, dark circles under her eyes, but her hands were steady as she helped him prepare the syringe. "How much do we give the first patient?" Krasner did the calculations in his head, factoring in body weight, infection severity, and estimated antibody concentration. 10 milliliters to start, intramuscular injection. We monitor for adverse reactions. Anaphylaxis, fever spike, cardiovascular distress. If the patient stabilizes, we can consider a second dose in 12 hours. And if the patient dies, then we stop. We document what went wrong, and we try to learn from it. Krasner's jaw tightened. But I don't think it will kill anyone, Marta. I think it's going to work. Faith in improvised medicine, Adamek said softly. That's a dangerous thing for a doctor to have. Faith in the human immune system, Krasner corrected. That's what saved those 3 men. We're just trying to share that salvation. They didn't have to wait long for their first test case. At dawn, the ambulances brought in casualties from a night raid, and among them was a young corporal with a bullet wound in his shoulder. The surgery went well. The bullet had passed through cleanly, missing major blood vessels. But 12 hours later, the familiar signs appeared. The wound began to darken. The corporal's temperature spiked. The black veins started to thread up his arm. Krasner found the young man's commanding officer in the waiting area, a grizzled sergeant who'd brought in the corporal personally. "I need your permission to try an experimental treatment on your man," Krasner said without preamble. "He's been infected with the same pathogen that's killed 13 soldiers in the past 2 weeks. Without intervention, he'll likely die within 48 hours. I've developed a serum that might save him, but it's untested. There are risks." The sergeant looked at him with eyes that had seen too many men die. "Will it hurt him? It might. We don't know all the side effects. But doing nothing will definitely kill him." "Most likely, yes." The sergeant was quiet for a moment, then nodded. "Do it. That boy saved 3 men during the raid last night. If there's a chance to save him, take it." They administered the first dose at 0800 hours. Krasner injected 10 milliliters of the serum into the corporal's deltoid muscle while Adamek monitored vital signs. The young man was barely conscious, his temperature at 40.5 degrees Celsius, his breathing shallow and rapid. For the first hour, nothing changed. The corporal's condition remained critical, but stable as a dying man could be. For the second hour, Krasner thought the fever might be dropping, but he couldn't be sure. His thermometer was old, potentially inaccurate. By the third hour, there was no doubt. The corporal's temperature had dropped to 39.8 degrees. The black discoloration in his veins had stopped spreading. His breathing had deepened, become more regular. By the 6th hour, the young man opened his eyes and asked for water. Nurse Adamek brought him a cup, her hands shaking slightly as she helped him drink. She looked at Krasner across the bed, and in her eyes was something between wonder and fear. "It's working," she whispered. "1 dose," Krasner cautioned. "1 patient. We need more data before we can be certain." But inside, beneath his careful scientist's skepticism, he felt a surge of something he'd almost forgotten: hope. The second patient arrived that evening, a private with an abdominal wound who'd been stable until the infection appeared. Krasner administered the serum. The response was slower than the first patient, but by morning the private's fever had broken and the dark veins were fading. The third patient came 2 days later, then a fourth, then 2 more on the same day. Each time Krasner followed the same protocol: careful examination, precise dosage, constant monitoring. And each time the serum worked. Not perfectly. There were side effects. Some patients developed rashes or temporary fevers. But every single patient who received the serum survived. The infection that had killed 13 men in 2 weeks suddenly became survivable. Word began to spread through the hospital. The crazy doctor with his improvised serum. The man who'd used a well bucket instead of a centrifuge. Some of the other physicians were skeptical, demanded to see his documentation, questioned his methods. But they couldn't argue with results. Soldiers who would have died were walking around the recovery ward, weak but alive, their dark veins fading to memory. By the end of the second week, Krasner had treated 17 patients with a 100% survival rate. That's when Colonel Volker arrived. Colonel Marcus Volker was the regional medical commander, a man in his 50s with steel-gray hair and a reputation for by-the-book efficiency. He appeared at the monastery hospital without warning, accompanied by 2 medical officers and a grim expression that suggested someone was about to be court-martialed. Krasner met him in the monastery's former rectory, which now served as the hospital's administrative office. Through the window, he could see soldiers being loaded into ambulances for transport to rear-area facilities, men who wouldn't have survived long enough for transport without the serum. "Dr. Krasner," Colonel Volker began, his voice clipped and professional, "I've received reports of unauthorized medical experimentation at this facility. Reports that you've been administering an untested, unapproved treatment to wounded soldiers without proper oversight or ethical review." Krasner had been expecting this. He stood at attention, his posture military correct despite his civilian status. "Sir, I've been administering a blood-derived antibody serum to soldiers infected with a rapidly fatal pathogen. The treatment has been documented according to standard medical protocols, and all patients have provided verbal consent when conscious, or treatment has been authorized by commanding officers when patients were unable to consent." "You created this serum in a field hospital?" Volker's tone suggested he found this difficult to believe. "What equipment?" "Improvised equipment, sir. Glass bottles, sterilized gauze, a well bucket for centrifugation, and basic injection apparatus." Krasner maintained eye contact. The infection was killing 93% of infected patients before the serum was available. After implementation of serum therapy, we've achieved a 100% survival rate across 17 cases. One of the medical officers with Volker scoffed. "Impossible. No treatment has a perfect success rate, especially not something cobbled together with farm equipment." "Then come with me to the recovery ward," Krasner said quietly. "I'll show you 17 impossible recoveries." Volker studied him for a long moment, then nodded. "Show me everything, your documentation, your patients, your process. If what you're claiming is true, this is either the most important medical development of the war or the most dangerous case of medical malpractice I've ever encountered." They spent the next 4 hours going through everything. Krasner showed them the detailed records he'd kept: patient names, infection timelines, serum dosages, response patterns, side effects. He showed them the 3 survivors whose blood had provided the original antibodies, all 3 men still healthy and recovering normally. He walked them through the recovery ward, introducing them to patients who'd been dying 2 days ago and were now sitting up, eating solid food, complaining about the hospital meals, the normal grumbling of soldiers who were going to live. Nurse Adamek provided her own testimony, explaining the sterilization protocols they'd followed, the care they'd taken to prevent contamination. She was professional and precise, refusing to let anyone suggest that Krasner had been reckless or cavalier with patient safety. By the time they finished, it was evening. The monastery's stone walls were turning gold in the sunset, and outside, the guns had fallen temporarily silent. Colonel Volker dismissed his medical officers, asked them to wait outside. Then he turned to Krasner, and his expression had shifted from suspicion to something more complex. "Doctor, what you've done here is either brilliant or insane, possibly both. You violated protocols, circumvented the chain of command, and conducted unauthorized human trials. By all rights, I should have you arrested." "Yes, sir," Krasner said. He'd known this was coming. But the alternative was watching more men die. The alternative, Volker corrected, was following proper channels, requesting specialists, waiting for official approval and support, which would have taken weeks, sir, possibly months. And in that time, how many more would have died? Volker was quiet for a moment. Then he reached into his briefcase and pulled out a folder. I came here prepared to shut down your operation and possibly have you court-martialed, but I'm going to do something different." He opened the folder, revealing official military documents. "I'm going to requisition proper laboratory equipment for this facility. I'm going to send you 3 trained laboratory technicians, and I'm going to issue orders for your serum to be produced at scale and distributed to every field hospital on this front." Krasner felt something tight in his chest loosen. "Sir? You saved 17 men, Doctor. If we can replicate your results across the entire theater of operations, we could save thousands." Volker's voice was gruff, but there was something like respect in it. "You're still getting a formal reprimand for your methods, but you're also getting a commendation for your results. And you're going to teach every medical officer in this command how to produce and administer your serum." "It's not really my serum, sir," Krasner said. "It's the antibodies from the survivors. I'm just the one who figured out how to share them." "Then we'll need those survivors to keep donating blood," Volker said. "Well, need protocols for identifying potential donors, for screening blood safety, for standardizing production. This is going to become a major operation, Doctor. Are you prepared for that?" Krasner thought about scaling up from a makeshift laboratory to a real medical program, thought about training others, about systematizing what had been pure improvisation. It would be complicated, bureaucratic, exhausting. It would also save lives on a scale he'd never imagined possible. "Yes, sir," he said. "I'm prepared." But preparation, Krasner would soon learn, was very different from reality. The next 3 weeks were chaos of a different kind. The promised equipment arrived: proper centrifuges, sterilization autoclaves, microscopes, refrigeration units powered by generators. The laboratory technicians showed up, 3 young men fresh from medical school, eager and terrified in equal measure. And the patients kept coming, more each day, as word spread that the monastery hospital could cure the infection, that other facilities could only watch kill their patients. Krasner trained the technicians in his improvised methods, then refined those methods with their help. They discovered that the serum could be frozen for storage without losing effectiveness, which meant they could build up reserves. They developed tests to screen donated blood for quality and safety. They created a standardized protocol: 10 milliliters for initial infection, 20 milliliters for advanced cases, follow-up doses at 12 and 24 hours if the patient didn't respond adequately. Private Novak, Corporal Benez, and Lieutenant Dvorak became the program's primary donors, each giving blood twice a week. Other survivors joined the donor pool as they recovered. Within a month, Krasner had enough serum to treat 50 patients. Within 2 months, he was producing enough to supply 3 other field hospitals. The infection still appeared. Soldiers still developed the dark veins, the deadly fevers. But now, instead of dying at a 93% rate, they survived at a 95% rate. The 5% who didn't survive were those who received treatment too late, whose infections had progressed too far before they reached a hospital that had access to the serum. The work was relentless. Krasner slept 4 hours a night, spent the rest of his time producing serum, treating patients, training new medical staff in the protocols. Nurse Adamek became his deputy, managing the donor program and the serum production schedule with military efficiency. The monastery hospital, which had been a backwater facility teetering on the edge of collapse, became a center of innovation that other hospitals studied and emulated. And then, in early December, everything changed again. A transport arrived carrying wounded from a battle 200 kilometers north. Among the casualties was a captain who'd been infected with something that looked like the familiar pathogen but behaved differently. The serum didn't work. The captain's fever spiked despite repeated doses. The dark veins spread faster than Krasner had ever seen. The captain died 36 hours after infection. Krasner performed an autopsy, standard procedure for any patient who died from the infection. What he found made his blood run cold. The pathogen had mutated. The antibodies in his serum recognized the original infection, but were only partially effective against this new variant. It was like fighting an enemy who changed uniforms and tactics overnight. He sent samples to the regional medical laboratory, requesting analysis. The response came back within a week, and it confirmed his fears. There were now two distinct strains of the infection circulating on the Eastern Front. The original strain, which his serum treated effectively, and this new strain, which required different antibodies. The solution was obvious but daunting. They needed to find survivors of the new strain and create a second serum. But the new strain was even more lethal than the first, killing at a 97% rate. Finding survivors would be difficult, and even if they found survivors, there was no guarantee their immune systems had produced antibodies that would work broadly across the infected population. Krasner gathered his team in the makeshift laboratory. Nurse Adamek, the 3 technicians, 2 other physicians who'd been transferred to the hospital specifically to learn serum production. "We have a new challenge," he said, explaining the situation. "The infection has evolved. We need to evolve with it." "How do we find survivors of the new strain?" one of the technicians asked. "It's killing people so quickly, most hospitals won't even realize it's a different infection until it's too late." "Then we send out alerts," Krasner said. "We contact every hospital in the region, tell them to watch for cases where our serum fails. Any patient who survives despite serum failure is potentially a donor for the new strain. We collect their blood, we analyze it, we develop a second serum." "And in the meantime," Adamek asked, "how many more will die while we search for survivors?" It was a question without a good answer. Krasner looked around at his team, these people who'd followed him into this improvised medical revolution, who'd trusted his judgment even when it seemed insane. "We keep doing what we're doing," he said. "We treat everyone who comes through those doors with the best tools we have, and we hope it's enough." It wasn't enough. Over the next 2 weeks, 7 patients died from the new strain. 7 men who should have been saved, who would have been saved if they'd been infected with the original pathogen, died despite everything Krasner and his team could do. Each death hit him harder than the last. Had saved so many, had proven that improvisation and courage could triumph over impossible odds. But the virus didn't care about his success rate or his innovative methods. It mutated, evolved, adapted. It was fighting back. On the 15th day after the new strain appeared, an ambulance brought in a sergeant from a northern unit. The man was infected with the new strain. Krasner could tell immediately from the rapid progression and the serum's minimal effect. He administered treatment anyway, hoping against hope that maybe this time it would work differently. The sergeant survived. His immune system fought off the infection in 4 days, faster than any previous survivor. When Krasner drew his blood for analysis, he found antibody levels higher than anything he'd seen before. This man's body had mounted a massive immune response, producing antibodies in extraordinary quantities. "This is it," Krasner said to Adamek, holding the blood sample up to the light. "This is our second serum. If we can process this properly, we can start saving lives again." They worked through the night, extracting and filtering the sergeant's serum, using the protocols they'd refined over the past 3 months. By morning, they had enough processed serum for 3 doses, 3 chances to find out if this new treatment would work. The first patient was a young private, infected for 18 hours with the new strain and deteriorating rapidly. Krasner administered 20 milliliters of the new serum, a higher initial dose based on the severity of the infection. Then he waited, watching the clock, monitoring vital signs, praying to a God he wasn't sure he believed in, that this improvised salvation would work twice. The private's fever broke 6 hours later. The dark veins stopped spreading. By morning, the young man was conscious and asking for food. The second and third patients showed similar responses. The new serum worked. Krasner expanded the donor pool, asking the sergeant and the 3 patients who'd survived treatment to donate blood regularly. Within a week, he was producing 2 different serums, the original for the first strain, the new one for the variant. Within 2 weeks, other hospitals were requesting supplies of both. The monastery hospital's makeshift laboratory became a production center, churning out vials of pale yellow fluid that meant the difference between life and death. But the work was taking its toll. Krasner was sleeping 3 hours a night, running on coffee and desperation. His hands shook from exhaustion. He'd developed a persistent cough that Adamek worried might be tuberculosis, but was probably just stress and fatigue. The other physicians at the hospital urged him to rest, to delegate more, to take care of himself. He ignored them. There were too many patients, too much work, too many lives depending on the serum production continuing without interruption. In late January, Colonel Volker returned. He found Krasner in the laboratory at 2 in the morning, processing blood samples by candlelight because the generator had failed. "Doctor, you look like hell," Volker said without preamble. "Thank you, sir," Krasner replied, not looking up from the centrifuge. "I'm aware. You're also being promoted and transferred." That made Krasner look up. "Sir?" Volker pulled out orders. "High Command has decided that your serum program needs to be expanded to cover the entire Eastern Front. They're establishing a central production facility at a hospital in Prague. You'll be in charge of it, with a staff of 25, proper equipment, and enough resources to produce serum at industrial scale. You leave in 3 days." Krasner stared at him. "Sir, I can't leave. This facility depends on—" "This facility will be fine," Volker interrupted. "We're assigning 2 experienced physicians to take over here. Your protocols are documented. Your team is trained." "They'll continue the work." He paused. "But you, doctor, you have the knowledge and experience to scale this up properly, to train physicians across the entire theater of operations, to turn your improvised miracle into a systematic program that saves thousands instead of hundreds." "I'm needed here," Krasner said, but he could hear the weakness in his own argument. "You're needed where you can have the greatest impact," Volker countered. "That's no longer this field hospital. It's Prague, with resources and support that will let you do this properly instead of improvising with well buckets and candlelight." Krasner looked around the makeshift laboratory, the monastery storage room that he'd converted into a medical facility through sheer determination and improvisation. He thought about the patients in the recovery ward, the soldiers who'd survived because he'd been willing to try something radical. He thought about Nurse Adamek, the technicians, the team that had trusted him when his methods seemed insane. "3 days," he said finally. "I'll need at least 3 days to prepare the transition." "You have 5, Volker said. "And, doctor, what you've done here, it's going to change military medicine. Not just for this war, but for every war that comes after. You should be proud of that." Pride wasn't what Krasner felt. Mostly he felt exhausted, overwhelmed by the weight of what had started. But underneath the exhaustion was something else. The knowledge that his improvised solution, born of desperation and his father's folk medicine, had proven that innovation didn't require perfect conditions or official approval. Sometimes it just required the courage to try something no one else had considered. The next 5 days were a blur of handoffs and documentation. Krasner trained the 2 incoming physicians on every detail of serum production and administration. He introduced them to the donor pool, to the patients, to the routines that kept the program running. He made sure Adamek would have the authority she needed to keep everything operating smoothly after he left. And he prepared himself mentally for the shift from improvised field medicine to industrial-scale production. On his last night at the monastery hospital, he walked through the wards one final time. The recovery ward held 32 patients, all of them survivors of infections that would have killed them 3 months ago. Some were playing cards, others were writing letters home. A few were sleeping peacefully, no longer burning with fever, no longer dying by inches. Private Novak, the first donor, approached him near the entrance. "Doctor, we heard you're leaving." "Orders," Krasner said. "I'm being transferred to Prague." "Will you keep making the serum there? Keep saving lives?" "That's the plan, on a much larger scale." Novak extended his hand. "Then thank you, sir, for saving my life, and for using that life to save others." They shook hands, and Krasner felt the calluses on the young soldier's palm, the rough hands of a farmer or laborer who'd been conscripted into war and had nearly died from an infection that medical science couldn't name, but who'd survived and whose blood had saved dozens of other men. "Thank you for being willing to donate," Krasner said. "Without you and the others, none of this would have worked." "We're all just trying to survive, Doctor. You gave us a way to help others do the same. That's worth a little needle stick every few days." The transport came the next morning. Krasner said goodbye to his team. To Adamek, who maintained professional composure but whose eyes were bright with unshed tears. To the patients and staff who'd become his makeshift family over the past 8 months. Then he climbed into the truck with his single bag of belongings and his stack of medical documentation, and watched the monastery hospital disappear behind him as they drove west toward Prague. The central production facility in Prague was everything the monastery hospital wasn't: modern, well-equipped, staffed by trained professionals who never had to improvise with well buckets. Krasner spent his first week simply adjusting to having proper resources: real centrifuges, autoclave sterilizers, refrigeration that didn't depend on temperamental generators. It felt almost decadent after months of working with improvised equipment. But the core of the work remained the same: blood from recovered patients, processed into serum, administered to the infected. The scale was larger, the methods more refined, but the fundamental principle hadn't changed. The human immune system knew how to fight this infection, and Krasner's job was to share that knowledge as widely as possible. Within a month, the Prague facility was producing enough serum to supply 12 hospitals. Within 2 months, 25. Krasner trained medical officers from across the Eastern Front in production protocols and administration techniques. The program he'd started in desperation became official military medicine, documented in manuals and taught in training courses. The mortality rate from the infection dropped from over 90% to under 10% across the entire theater of operations. Thousands of soldiers who would have died instead recovered, returned to duty, or were sent home to their families. The serum became as essential as morphine or bandages, a standard part of every field hospital's medical supplies. And through it all, Krasner kept thinking about that first night, standing over a dying soldier with a broken needle in his hand, making the decision to try something radical because the alternative was unacceptable. That moment had changed everything, not just for him, but for thousands of men who would never know his name, who would never realize that their lives had been saved by improvised medicine created in a monastery with equipment cobbled together from whatever was available. The war continued. The Eastern Front remained a meat grinder where men died by the thousands for reasons that increasingly seemed senseless. But in the midst of that chaos, Krasner's serum provided a rare glimpse of hope, proof that human ingenuity and courage could triumph over seemingly impossible odds, that innovation didn't require perfect conditions, that sometimes the best medicine came from refusing to accept that there was nothing more to be done. In March 1945, as the war ground toward its inevitable conclusion, Krasner received word that the monastery hospital had been overrun during a German offensive. Most of the staff had been evacuated in time, including Nurse Adamek and the medical team he'd trained. But the facility itself had been destroyed, the makeshift laboratory reduced to rubble, the recovery ward where he'd saved his first 17 patients now just broken stone and memories. He stood in his Modern Prague laboratory, surrounded by equipment and resources that would have seemed like impossible luxury 8 months ago, and thought about that destroyed monastery, about the improvised centrifuge made from a well bucket, about the soldiers who'd survived because he'd been willing to try something that everyone else thought was insane. The facility was gone, but the innovation it had birthed continued. The serum was saving lives across the front. Other physicians were adapting his protocols, finding new applications, improving on his improvised methods. The desperate gamble he'd taken had become mainstream medicine. That spring, Colonel Volkers visited Prague to review the serum production program. He found Krasner in the laboratory, supervising a batch of serum processing for shipment to field hospitals in Hungary. "Doctor, I have the final statistics for you," Volker said, handing him a folder. "Through the end of February, your serum program has treated 9,840 soldiers across the Eastern Front. The survival rate is 92%. Conservative estimates suggest you've saved approximately 9,000 lives." Krasner opened the folder, scanned the numbers. 9,000 lives. Each one representing a man who'd been dying, who would have died, who instead went home or back to duty because an improvised serum had shared the antibodies of survivors. It was almost too large to comprehend. "It's not just me," he said quietly. "It was the donors who gave blood, the nurses and technicians who processed it, the physicians who administered it, the patients who were willing to try an experimental treatment. All I did was have an idea and the desperation to try it. You had more than that," Volker said. "You had the courage to break protocols when protocols were failing, the intelligence to improvise solutions when standard procedures weren't available, and the commitment to keep pushing forward even when it seemed impossible." He paused. "That's not common, doctor. Most physicians would have followed proper channels, waited for official approval, and watched patients die while they waited. You refused to accept that. My father taught me that," Krasner said. "He saved a herd of cattle with improvised serum when I was a boy. I just scaled up his technique." "Then your father would be proud." Volker closed the folder. "The High Command is recommending you for a medal. You'll probably be decorated when the war ends." Krasner thought about medals, about official recognition and military honors. They seemed hollow compared to the real accomplishment. The 9,000 men who were alive because he'd been willing to try something radical. The soldiers who'd go home to their families, who'd have futures they wouldn't have had without the serum. "I don't need a medal," he said. "I just needed to save lives. That was always the only mission." "Nevertheless, you'll get one," Volker said, "and you've earned it, whether you think so or not." The war ended in May. The guns fell silent, the soldiers began going home, and the Eastern Front transformed from a battlefield into a landscape of refugees and ruins. The serum program continued. Infections didn't stop just because the fighting had, but gradually the demand decreased as wounded soldiers were no longer flooding into field hospitals by the thousands. In August, Krasner was officially decorated by the military command. He stood in a Prague ceremony hall while a general pinned a medal to his chest and read a citation about medical innovation and lives saved. There were speeches about his courage and brilliance, about how his work represented the best of wartime medicine. Krasner accepted the medal politely, said the appropriate words of gratitude, and thought about Private Novak holding out his arm for a blood draw without hesitation, about Nurse Adamak swinging a bucket in circles over a monastery well at midnight, about 13 dead men whose names he still remembered, who died before he figured out how to save them. After the ceremony, he was approached by a man in civilian clothes who introduced himself as a representative from the University of Vienna. "Dr. Krasner, we'd like to offer you a position in our medical school, Chair of Immunology. We've been following your work, and we believe you're exactly the kind of innovative thinker we need to rebuild our medical programs for the post-war era." A university position, a return to teaching and research, to the academic world he'd left behind when he was transferred to the monastery hospital. It was the kind of opportunity he'd once dreamed of, the pinnacle of medical career achievement. "Thank you," Krasner said. But I need to think about it. That night, he walked through Prague's old town, past buildings that had survived the war and buildings that hadn't, past people trying to rebuild their lives in the aftermath of years of destruction. He thought about what he wanted to do with the rest of his career, with the knowledge and experience he'd gained during the war. The academic position was prestigious, comfortable, safe, but it was also removed from the immediate reality of saving lives, from the frontline medicine that had defined the past 2 years. He could teach students about serum therapy and antibody extraction, but he wouldn't be producing serum himself, wouldn't be treating patients who needed immediate intervention. There was another option. He'd received several letters from physicians at field hospitals asking if he'd consider helping establish similar serum programs in other regions, training medical staff in improvised techniques that could be applied to various infectious diseases. It wasn't prestigious academic work. It was practical, hands-on medicine in resource-limited settings, exactly the kind of challenging, improvised work he'd been doing at the monastery hospital. In the end, the choice was obvious. He declined the Vienna position and instead accepted a role with the Red Cross, traveling to regions devastated by the war and helping establish serum programs for various infectious diseases. He taught nurses and physicians in destroyed hospitals how to work with limited resources, how to improvise when standard equipment wasn't available, how to think creatively about solutions to medical challenges. The work was hard, often frustrating, occasionally dangerous, but it was real. It saved lives, and it used the skills Krasner had developed during those desperate months at the monastery hospital. The ability to improvise, to adapt, to refuse to accept that there was nothing more to be done. Years later, when he was an old man and medical students asked him about the war, about the serum program that had saved thousands of lives, Krasner would always start the story the same way, with a needle breaking in his hand and a soldier dying on an operating table, with the moment when he decided that improvisation was better than helplessness, that trying something radical was preferable to watching more men die. War teaches you what matters, he would tell those students. Not protocols or proper procedures or academic credentials. Those things have their place, but when people are dying in front of you, what matters is whether you're willing to try something new, to take a risk, to improvise a solution when the standard approaches aren't working. But what if you'd been wrong, they would ask? What if the serum had killed people instead of saving them? And Krasner would always give the same answer. Then I would have stopped and tried something else. The one thing I couldn't do was nothing. That was never an option. The monastery hospital where it all began was rebuilt in 1947, converted back to its original purpose as a religious community. The monks who returned found no trace of the makeshift laboratory, the recovery ward, the impromptu operating theaters. The war had erased all physical evidence of what had happened there. But in medical schools across Europe, students learned about blood-derived antibody serums. In field hospitals around the world, physicians used similar techniques to treat infectious diseases. In military medical protocols, improvised serum therapy became a standard procedure, documented and approved, no longer radical or controversial. The monastery stones remembered nothing. But the thousands of men who'd survived because of what happened within those stones remembered everything. They went home to their families, lived their lives, told their children about the crazy doctor who'd saved them with medicine created in a well bucket and a desperate hope that the human immune system could be shared like a gift passed from survivor to survivor. And sometimes, in the quiet moments before sleep, those survivors would feel the faint tracery of scars where dark veins had once spread beneath their skin, would remember the fever and the fear and the moment when a doctor with exhausted eyes and shaking hands had given them an injection of pale yellow fluid and said, "This might save your life. We're going to find out together." Most of them never learned the doctor's name, but all of them remembered being saved. That was Krasner's real legacy, not the medal or the accolades or the medical papers published about his work, but the thousands of anonymous moments when life continued because he'd been willing to improvise, to take risks, to refuse to accept that death was inevitable. In the end, medicine wasn't about perfect technique or ideal conditions. It was about finding solutions with whatever resources were available, about sharing the strength of survivors with those still fighting to survive. The war ended. The soldiers went home. The infections were treated and cured. And in a rebuilt monastery in Eastern Europe, monks prayed in a chapel that had once been a recovery ward, walking over stones that had witnessed one man's refusal to accept the impossible. They didn't know the history beneath their feet, but the stones remembered. And somewhere in the world, soldiers with faded scars and second chances at life remembered too. The innovation born of desperation had become permanent medicine. The improvised solution had become standard practice. And the crazy doctor who'd started it all had proven that sometimes the most important medical equipment wasn't expensive machinery or cutting-edge facilities. It was the courage to try something new when lives were hanging in the balance. 9,847 treated patients, 92% survival rate, one broken needle that sparked a revolution. These were the numbers that mattered. These were the statistics that told the story of how one physician's refusal to accept death as inevitable changed military medicine forever. But the real story wasn't in the numbers. It was in the individual moments. A young soldier asking for water after his fever broke. A nurse's hands steady as she processed blood samples at midnight. A colonel deciding to trust innovation over protocol. A donor rolling up his sleeve without hesitation because he understood that his survival could mean survival for others. It was in every injection of pale yellow serum, every fever that broke, every life that continued because someone had been willing to improvise a solution instead of accepting that there was nothing more to be done. Emil Krasner died in 1983 at the age of 76. His obituary mentioned his work during the war, the Serum program that had saved thousands, his years of service with the Red Cross teaching improvised medical techniques in resource-limited settings. But it couldn't capture the full scope of what he'd accomplished. Not just the lives saved, but the paradigm shifted. The proof that innovation could come from desperation and improvisation as easily as from well-funded laboratories. At his funeral, 3 old men stood together near the back of the ceremony. They didn't speak much, just stood in quiet solidarity, remembering. Private Novak, Corporal Benes, and Lieutenant Dvorak, the 3 survivors whose blood had started everything, who'd been willing to donate repeatedly because they understood they'd been given something precious and that precious things were meant to be shared. After the ceremony, Novak approached Krasner's daughter, a woman in her 50s who'd become a physician herself, following in her father's footsteps. "Your father saved my life," he said simply. "And then he used my life to save dozens of others. I just wanted you to know that. I wanted you to know what kind of man he was." She knew. She'd grown up hearing the stories, had watched her father dedicate his life to the principle that medicine was about finding solutions, not accepting limitations. But hearing it from one of the original donors, one of the men whose survival had made everything else possible, gave the story a weight it hadn't had before. "Thank you," she said, "for being willing to donate, for trusting him when his methods seemed crazy." "It wasn't crazy," Novak replied. "It was exactly what was needed. Your father understood that sometimes the best answer isn't the official answer. Sometimes it's the one you improvise when everything else has failed." That evening, as the sun set over Prague, Krasner's daughter went through her father's personal papers, sorting through decades of documentation. She found his original notes from the monastery hospital. Hastily written observations, calculations done on scraps of paper, diagrams of improvised equipment drawn with a shaking hand. And she found a letter he'd written but never sent, dated from those first desperate weeks. To my father, who taught me that solutions come from necessity and courage, not from perfect conditions. I'm using your technique with the cattle scaled up to humans. It's working. Men who should be dying are surviving. I don't know if this will continue to work or if I'll be court-martialed for trying, but I know you'd understand why I couldn't do nothing. Sometimes the answer isn't in the textbooks. Sometimes it's in remembering that blood carries more than just oxygen. It carries survival itself, and that survival can be shared. Thank you for teaching me to improvise. Thank you for showing me that the most important medical tool is the refusal to accept defeat. She held the letter for a long time. This message from her father to his father. This documentation of the moment when desperation became innovation and improvisation became revolution. Then she carefully filed it with the rest of his papers, preserving it as evidence of what one physician had accomplished when he refused to let protocols stand between him and saving lives. The next day, she returned to her own work at a hospital in Prague. Coincidentally, the same facility that had once been the central serum production center her father had run during the war. The building had been modernized, renovated, updated with the latest medical technology. But somewhere in the building's foundation were the stones that had witnessed her father's work, the space where he'd scaled up improvised medicine to save thousands. She walked through the modern immunology department, past sophisticated equipment that would have seemed like science fiction in 1943, past researchers working on cutting-edge treatments for infectious diseases. And she thought about her father in a monastery storage room, spinning blood samples in a well bucket because he didn't have a centrifuge, filtering serum through layers of gauze because proper lab equipment wasn't available. The technology had advanced, the methods had been refined, but the core principle remained unchanged. When people are dying and standard procedures aren't working, you improvise. You adapt. You try something new, even if it seems crazy, even if you might be wrong, because trying is always better than accepting defeat. That was Emil Krasner's legacy, not just the lives saved or the medical innovations documented in textbooks, but the proof that courage and creativity could triumph over impossible circumstances. That the best medical breakthroughs sometimes came from desperate improvisation rather than planned research. 9,847 soldiers survived because one physician refused to accept that there was nothing more he could do. Because he remembered his father saving cattle with improvised serum. Because he was willing to try something radical when conventional medicine was failing. Because he understood that the human immune system was a gift meant to be shared. And in hospitals around the world, whenever physicians face impossible situations and limited resources, they remember that lesson. They remember that improvisation isn't failure, it's innovation born of necessity. They remember that the most important question isn't what does the protocol say, but rather, what can I try that might save this patient? The war ended more than 4 decades ago. The monastery hospital is gone. The makeshift laboratory was destroyed. The physicians and nurses who witnessed the beginning of the Serum program have nearly all passed away. But the innovation continues. The technique has been refined, improved, incorporated into modern medical practice. And somewhere in every teaching hospital, medical students learn about blood-derived antibody treatments, about the importance of improvisation in resource-limited settings, about the physician who saved thousands with equipment cobbled together from whatever was available. They learn the statistics. 9,847 treated patients, 92% survival rate. They learn the technique. Extract antibodies from survivors, process into serum, administer to the infected. They learn the outcome, a medical innovation that changed military medicine forever. But the numbers and the technique and the outcome don't capture the real story. The real story is about the moment when one physician, standing over a dying soldier with a broken needle in his hand, decided that improvisation was better than helplessness, that trying something radical was preferable to watching more men die, that the human immune system's ability to fight infection could be shared like hope itself, passed from survivor to survivor, one injection at a time. That was the real miracle of the serum, not the medical technique or the survival statistics, but the proof that innovation doesn't require perfect conditions. It just requires someone willing to try, to improvise, to refuse to accept that there's nothing more to be done. Emil Krasner was that someone. And because he was willing to try, 9,000 men went home to their families instead of dying in field hospitals on the Eastern Front. Because he improvised, military medicine was revolutionized. Because he refused to accept defeat, a technique born in desperation became standard medical practice. The monastery stones remember nothing, but the thousands who survived remember everything. And in medical schools around the world, students continue to learn the lesson that Krasner proved in a desperate autumn of 1943. Sometimes the best medicine comes not from laboratories or textbooks, but from courage, creativity, and the refusal to let people die when there might be something, anything, that could save them. That's the real story of the improvised serum, not the technique or the statistics, but the proof that one person's desperate innovation can save thousands, that improvisation can become revolution, that the human capacity for creative problem-solving is as powerful as any medication ever developed. And in the end, that's what changed military medicine forever. Not the serum itself, but the principle behind it. The understanding that when lives are at stake and standard procedures are failing, you don't give up. You improvise, you adapt, you try something new. You do whatever it takes to save one more life. And then another, and another, until 9,000 lives have been saved, and the impossible has become routine. And the crazy doctor with his well-bucket centrifuge has proven that innovation born of desperation can be just as powerful, sometimes more powerful, than innovation born of perfect laboratory conditions. That was Emil Krasner's gift to medicine. Not just a technique, but a principle. Not just lives saved, but proof that saving lives doesn't require perfect conditions. It just requires the courage to try.